Hello, my horror-loving dudes. I'm KillJoy Jake, and today we're going to be ranking all 5 of the Evil Dead films. This is one of the hardest ranking videos I've ever had to do because I consider all 5 of the Evil Dead movies to be masterpieces, so I'm going to be tearing my hair out throughout the making of this video. Oh boy, let's get into it.
Well, sometimes that is better.
Before we get into the ranking, I do just want to say that obviously this is just my own personal list. Everybody ranks every single franchise differently, so if you have a difference in opinion, leave it for me in the comments below. Coming in last, but certainly not least, is Army of Darkness. The most comedic Evil Dead film is one of the most interesting because it definitely paints Ash Williams as this like big hero type character. Evil Dead 2 does that as well, but I feel like Army of Darkness is the movie that really painted him to be like this godlike figure and a character that nothing could truly stop. He was invincible. He was just gonna get through everything easily, and it's kind of fun to watch for that reason. Sometimes the film gets a bit too ridiculous even for my taste, but I still love it. It's so much fun. The slapstick humor of this movie is over the top and ridiculous. Like, there are sequences that are super creepy. Like the whole windmill sequence I think is a really creepy scene, but it's also really goofy because you have these little Ashes running around and they're talking all high up in like this voice. Even some of the practical effects are ridiculous. Like, you get to the scene where Ash finds all 3 of the Necronomicons and he gets sucked into one of them into what I can only imagine is a vortex to hell. It feels very like Three Stooges humor, which is such a weird injection into the Evil Dead franchise of all things, but oddly, it kind of works. It definitely doesn't work for everybody, and like I said, this one took a long time to grow on me, but after a couple of watches, I've really come to appreciate this one, especially because of the director's cut ending, which is far superior to the theatrical cut. Instead of Ash just going back to his time and he's at S-Mart, that whole thing, I like it, it's fine, but the original ending was so much cooler. The original ending, though, featured Ash getting into his car, putting it into a cave, basically Back to the Future 3, and he's supposed to take 5 drops of this little magic potion thing, and that'll take him right back to his time. He messes that up, he takes 6 drops, and then he's in the future where a Deadite apocalypse is occurring. But hey, at least we got a little taste of that in Ash vs. the Evil Dead. It was something. We got something from it. I really like Army of Darkness, though. It's one of my all-time favorite horror comedies, and it's probably the most fun Evil Dead film there is. Coming in 4th place, which just breaks my heart, is Evil Dead 2. I love Evil Dead 2 so much. I feel like this is the first time we get the true Ash Williams in an Evil Dead film. In the original Evil Dead, we get Ash Williams, who is kind of just your standard final guy character. I mean, that is still different for that movie, opposed to doing a final girl in like a slasher or possession film, but I appreciate what they did character-wise with him in Evil Dead 2. At this point, he's a survivor. He has gone through so much trauma and hell that he is just an entirely different person, and I just love seeing Bruce Campbell devolve into madness throughout the first half of this movie. It is so much fun to watch. His physical performance in this movie is maybe one of the best in horror movie history. Opposed to the stupid young people we got from the first Evil Dead, we get Jake and Linda, who are really fascinating characters. So is Bobby Joe, but she doesn't do that much. I feel like I'm much more interested in Jake and Linda as characters in this movie. Jake is an absolute dumbass, which adds to the horror and makes this movie so much more frustrating, but that's so fun. I don't know if I would go so far as to say that I like these characters more than the original Evil Dead, but they definitely do play into some much more interesting things here. Like the whole misconception thing about Ash being the one who killed the family at the cabin. Like, that's really interesting. That's a character dynamic we don't really get from the first Evil Dead that I find really interesting here in the sequel. I think the dynamics are better in Evil Dead 2, but ultimately I'd like the characters more in the first Evil Dead. One of my all-time favorite scenes in a horror flick is in Evil Dead 2 when like literally everything in the cabin just starts laughing at Ash. That sequence totally embodies the tone of this film, which is a little goofier than the first movie, but also still has that horror aspect to it. Sometimes that's to this film's detriment. Like, there are some sequences where I feel like they couldn't decide if they wanted to make this full-blown horror or just a comedy sequence. This sequence in particular, where everything's laughing at him, I feel like is the one scene in the movie where they capture the comedy and the horror at the same time really, really, really well. Because the sequence is initially goofy, but as it goes on, this creep factor starts to build that I really like about it. I don't feel that about every scene in Evil Dead 2. Most of it is just really silly to me, especially when the green blood and all that starts spraying on the wall, but I still love this film. It is a blast from start to finish. Taking the bronze medal is Evil Dead Rise from director Lee Cronin, just came out this weekend. Evil Dead Rise feels like a spiritual sequel to Evil Dead 2 in the way that it kind of has a little bit of comedy and then mostly horror. Personally, I think Rise does the balance of horror to comedy just a little better than Evil Dead 2, making it only a little bit of comedy here and there in doses, while the film is at its heart a horror film. I really appreciate that Evil Dead Rise doesn't necessarily rely on gore for all of its really scary sequences. Like, the whole sequence at the door with the mom and the little girl is one of the scariest moments in the entire film, and there's really no gore or blood in that whole scene. I mean, if you count the dead bodies in the hallway, then okay, yeah, but my point is nobody's getting murdered in this sequence. It's just a really scary conversation between Mama Deadite and her used-to-be daughter. The trailer does not do that one justice. You have to see this one in the theater. Oh my god, was that insane. But it does, of course, feature some really gory and gnarly deaths throughout this film. Like, I love Staphne. Staphne is so funny. That is such a funny setup to a kill. It goes right through the Deadite daughter's mouth, through her neck and all that. Ugh, I love that. Kills like that they're very easy to do, but always very effective to me. I also love the cheese grater burning that character. Why am I hating on this character so much? I actually liked her. But of course, the spectacle of Evil Dead Rise is its third act, where we get an elevator full of blood. All of the Deadites come together to form a super Deadite, which is insane, and I never thought I would see something like that on film. And then it's killed with a chainsaw and a wood chipper. So like, does it really get better than that for a third act? I don't think so. I have my little gripes with Evil Dead Rise, but it's nothing that takes away from the film. I think everything is there. The only thing I would change is just in the editing room. I would put the very end of the film where you get that character who goes to the cabin in the woods. I would just do all of that at the very beginning of the movie, personally. That's the only thing I would really change about the film. Besides that, I loved it. Evil Dead Rise is an absolute banger. It definitely deserves that third spot. Taking the silver is going to be the original Evil Dead, which holds a very special place in my heart. This was one of the first really scary horror films I ever watched when I was young, and it still messes me up to this day. The original Evil Dead is still the scariest to me. There's something about this film, the vibe of it, that just feels like a snuff film you're not supposed to be watching. I don't know if this really applies to any other movie besides the original Evil Dead and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but there's something about the effects and the low budget feel in this movie that give it its own kind of creep value that you can't find in any other horror film. I just love that about the original Evil Dead. The Deadites also have a specific look that none of the other sequels have really copied. The blank eyes, the purplish makeup, there's something about it that is just so special. The idea of the Deadites is so interesting to me too. You basically take like Romero toxic zombies and make them smarter, working together, and demonic. It's a great mixture of horror ideas just slapped together all into this kind of new thing. The whole Necronomicon idea is obviously inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's stories, but I still love it, man. It's so interesting. It's such a cool new take on horror films. And like kind of the zombie subgenre, I can see why Stephen King praised this bad boy all the way back in the early 80s. It's a little slow to get into and there's some obvious setup that comes back for something later, but it's done in a way that's like, it just keeps your attention enough to the point when you get to the first Deadite possession. That is something so special because you're kind of in this funk at the beginning of the movie where you're like, I don't know if I like this or not. Is this going anywhere? And then when it hits hard, man, and it's so surprising. My father showed me this film before he gave me the sex talk, and let me tell you, that has f***ed me up my entire life. So this movie will always be super scary in my mind. And coming in first place is maybe my all-time favorite horror film, Evil Dead 2013. Fede Alvarez made a movie that was kind of a spiritual successor to the original Evil Dead that keeps that scary feeling to it and maybe does it even better. To this day, it is one of the scariest horror films I have ever seen and one of the hardest to watch because of all the mutilation and just the horrible things these 5 characters go through in the runtime. It's a tiny, contained little story, which are always my favorite horror films as well, just about 5 characters trying to help one of them get over a drug addiction. It's simple at its core, it doesn't need to be overcomplicated, it's just a fun little story. Those are my absolute favorite kind of horror films. I hate when something gets too big and then it's like, okay, y'all gotta take it back a little bit. Y'all are getting into some crazy territory there. Just do something simple and fun. That's always the most effective thing in my opinion. Evil Dead 2013 is very mean-spirited as well. Like, it makes its characters suffer through things that they would never live through in real life, but it adds to the horror and flavors this film in a whole new way. Eric, for instance, would never live through half of what he went through in this movie. But do I care? No, it adds something new. It adds this whole new level of horror. This movie is the most efficient horror film I've ever seen because instead of having like 100 characters die in very brutal ways, we have just 5 characters suffering throughout this film. So you don't have to waste time by setting up new characters to then kill them in the next scene. Maybe it's unrealistic, but I feel like you're missing the point if you think that about this film. It's all about the maiming. It's simple, it's effective, it's one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. I truly think that this is the blueprint for a perfect horror movie. I also love the Abomination character that we get at the end, which is kind of a mix of all 5 of the characters put together. It's such an interesting new take on Evil Dead. I don't know, I could talk about how much I love this movie all day long. It's such an over-the-top, efficient horror movie. I love it. It's perfect. I wouldn't change a damn thing about it. The score is amazing, the cinematography cinematography is gorgeous. It's not even necessarily a remake of the original Evil Dead, but it does take that tone of being like the most scary horror film imaginable that original film captured so well, and brings that back into the fourth entry in the franchise. While I love the comedic aspects of Army of Darkness and Evil Dead 2, I love what Evil Dead 2013 did for this franchise by making it scary again. We've now seen that carry over into Evil Dead Rise, and I love it. The scarier, darker, gorier you can make something, the better, in my opinion. I just love that shit. I eat it up. How would you rank all 5 of the Evil Dead films, though? Leave it for me in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching my ranking of all 5 of the Evil Dead films. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more horror content in the future. Please consider supporting me on Patreon if you want to see this channel grow, and as always, don't forget to kill it out there, y'all.